I'm sorry, Neil, guys. So what do you think? Yeah. Is it fear that motivates many of the extremist Muslims to follow these individuals, or what do you think? Or do you think they really believe this stuff? Or?
Well, that's a good question. The official American view is that it's a handful of extremists who are corrupting a religion of peace.
Yes.
And I think that the question is how big is the handful, and I think that it may be a huge handful.
Right.
They've done some surveys in. I'll give you some numbers that kind of give you some parameters on this.
Okay.
If you measure hostility towards Jews in the Muslim world, in Jordan you find more than 99% score anti-Semitic on the types of surveys that would count in the West.
Wow.
And it never goes much below 65%. Right. If you ask people what they think of Osama bin Laden, you find that throughout the Muslim world, the support is at least 15-20% and often up to 50-60% for people who think that his vision of the world has a fair amount of merit to it. If you ask people do they prefer President Bush or Osama bin Laden's vision for the future, you even find, you find very large numbers who say Osama bin Laden. Now, if you ask, do you support suicide bombings or terrorism in defense of the faith, you will find that number gets up sometimes to 25, 30, 45% of the population. Now, these numbers are not, when somebody says they support it,
exactly right,
it doesn't mean they're going to do it. And so the number of people who are actually willing to act on these beliefs and endanger their own lives, that's obviously much, much smaller. But clearly, it's not like there's a population out there of peace lovers who are appalled by all of this, and that just 1% or less than 1% of the population that supports it. It's much more like a good chunk, probably less than a majority, but more than 10-15%. They've done surveys even in the United States, which has been relatively immune to homegrown Muslim terrorism and extremism. And what they've found here is that when you look among younger Muslims, and you try to assess support for terrorism, it still is only a small percentage, but I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it rises into the teens or maybe possibly close to 20% of people in the youth category who are supportive on some occasions of terrorism in defense of Islam. Now, what does defense mean? Like a lot of these guys say they only support defensive jihad or defensive.
Right. I see this is going, but are they talking about just defending the purity of the faith, or are they talking about defending their country, whatever, or their
it's not clear. Some of the, if you go to liberal sociologists, politically liberal sociologists and political scientists, they will say that basically what's going on is that this is a reaction to American intrusion on their national autonomy. And so that the idea is that this is a political rebellion which is taking the coloration of religion because that's the only way that they can kind of define their movement, that there's no more communism to draw on, nationalism is defunct, so they're defining it as a religious movement, but it's really a reaction to our kind of cultural and political imperialism. But I think that I don't buy that. I think that there's much more religion about the whole thing, and I think that that even were we to more or less get out and mind our own business, you would still find an awful lot of religion-motivated hatred coming out of there.
Wow. 888-503-0802. You're listening to the Infidel Guy Show. We have about 24 minutes to the top of the hour and the end of the program, so we have a lot more time here. So, guys, I know you have plenty of questions, and I am looking now in the stick cam room, so feel free to retype your questions if you don't feel like calling in.
Now, another point that I'd like to make is that in my book, I really take a three-level analysis. That I first look at the ideology, then I look at the psychology of extremism, and then kind of the sociology and politics. So first you have to have the texts there. Then you have to have particular individuals who are psychologically prone to becoming extremists, and that these individuals are more likely to show up in certain types of societies or countries.
Okay.
So what I thought it might be useful to talk for a moment and to focus on, well, what type of individual?
I've always joked and said it's always the craziest one that always seems to stand. It's always the craziest and the loudest guy. Kind of the analogy I use is like bullies in school or these popular kids in school or something. And I've noticed that like a lot of these kids hang out with these when they join these gangs, they typically tend to follow the guy that's the craziest. I don't know if they're afraid of him or they feel protected when they're with him. I don't know what the deal is, but that's just my quick little.
You know, if you look at Osama himself,
okay,
and you ask, well, does he fit that?
Right.
He definitely, since he was a young man, people regarded him as a little bit unusual. But the way he was unusual was that, first of all, he was very religious. And not in an extreme sense, but he was like following every single rule of the religion. He was huge. He was very tall. When the other guys would go out for a good time, he would never be interested in going with them. And he kind of set himself aside by virtue of his purity, and he would never compromise on anything.
Right.
And that was kind of, so in his sense, it is a type of a way of standing out from the crowd, but not as the bully.
Right.
He had some real odd things about his personality, and some of them served him very well as a terrorist. Right. One was that he, even though he was super, super rich, he wanted to train himself to eat very little and get by on and live under very poor circumstances, and things like that. So, so he kind of seems to me like a pure type of religious extremist than some of the others.
But it's interesting, but we're still talking about, obviously, so far, oddballs, which typically tends to, so far, anyway.
Yeah, no, I think here's what I think. I don't think happy guys become terrorists. I think that's probably a starting point for all.
Okay.
The question is, what type of unhappy are we talking about?
Right.
That psychologists have not been very good at identifying the profile of the terrorist. People in the government, I've done some work with some people, they try to develop profiles of the extremists so that they can use it in police work in identifying them.
Yes.
And when they try to do it, they realize that there's no simple profile. At first they thought that the suicide bomber was somebody who was very young, who was alienated from their society, and who was being basically brainwashed and misled by some leader. And that was the idea that they had based on the early suicide bombers against Israel. They were often somebody who you would catch him on a weak moment, somebody who was really into the movement and who would never ever think of putting their own butt on the line, would take one of these people, strap them, send them, and before they knew what was what, they'd blown themselves up.
Right.
And sometimes the idea was it was somebody who had brought a lot of shame on their family, and that this was a way to kind of undo the shame. But then with 9/11, the image changed very much because the 9/11 hijackers were educated people. Muhammad Atta, who was pursuing a graduate degree in Germany. He was extremely sharp student of language. He knew science. His father was I believe an attorney. And the profile was pretty different. And that we're finding with a lot of the people who went to fight in the jihad in Afghanistan that we are not talking really about people at the bottom of the socio and economic spectrum.
Right.
They also are not necessarily all motivated by piety in the way that I said that Osama was.
Right.
Sometimes you find somebody who's more of an operations guy and kind of gets involved for whatever reason in these activities and lets the religious guys do their stuff, but really doesn't observe the rules very carefully and is carrying out terrorist operations on behalf of the believers, but doesn't seem to be much of a believer in himself or herself.